Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. Does anybody know my dad, Dwayne King, here? Okay, a couple of you. Yep. He's no longer with us here on earth, which is one of the saddest days of my life, to lose my dad. If he were here, he would say he was more handsome than me. I don't know if you guys think that or not, but we'll give him that, right? My name is J.D. King, Jonathan Dwayne, so my middle name is Dwayne. J.D. could stand for Jesus' disciple, right, King, or John Deere. Any green guys in here, or green people? John Deere King? Or juvenile delinquent king, or my wife might say just dumb king. No, she doesn't say that. But it's really good to be here with you. My father was preaching the story. I want to make sure I'm done when I'm supposed to be done. What time am I supposed to be done? 10. Okay. So I can go to 10:15. Is that? My dad. The story how my dad ministered to deaf people, and he felt a calling upon himself to share the gospel with deaf people. And I'll tell a quick story how my dad met deaf people. He was the preacher at a church in Norfolk, Nebraska, and that's where Nebraska Christian College used to be. And he was preaching at First Christian Church there. And he had never met a deaf person. This is 1964 or something like that. And a man in the church owned some apartments, and it was around Christmas time, and this man in the church said to my dad, hey, I want to give $20 to this deaf couple that rent an apartment from me, just as a Christmas gift. Back then, $20 meant a whole lot more than it does today, right? So it's probably like $100 today. And so he said, I don't want to give it to them myself because I don't want them to think I'm a nice guy, because I'm their landlord. I don't want them to think I'm a softie, you know. So he said, would you mind taking it to him? And so my dad said, sure. So my dad rang the doorbell, and the light came on inside. And that's, you know, if you're deaf, you don't hear the doorbell really, and so you see the light. And so a lady came to the door, and she was deaf, and my dad had never met a deaf person. So he's writing notes to this lady, deaf lady, saying, my name's Dwayne King from First Christian Church, and here's the $20 gift. And then pretty soon her husband came home, found my dad writing notes to his wife, but it went okay. But so my dad started writing notes to both of them, and just introduced himself, and he said, well, why don't you come to church? And they say, well, if we came to church, we wouldn't get anything out of it. Why would we come to church, you know? And my dad just, in that moment, this is 1964, just felt a sinking feeling. It's like, well, deaf people need to know Jesus as well. And so he said, if you come to church, I'll learn some signs. And they ended up coming to church a particular Sunday. And that particular Sunday, the sermon Dad was preaching about was, and he learned just a few signs, it's Jesus is wonderful. And he kept, wonderful is Jesus, Jesus is wonderful. And they kind of laughed a little bit every time he did that. But he went through his whole sermon, and after the service, they walked out, and he started writing notes. He said, did you get anything out of the sermon? Thank you for coming. And they said, yes, we understood a lot of what you said because we could speech read your big mouth. And if you knew my dad, he does have a big mouth, or he did have a big mouth, does have a big mouth. Anyway, and then he said, well, how come every time I did my signs, you laughed? You kind of snickered and laughed. And they said, well, we understood what you were saying, but you were saying Jesus is headlights instead of wonderful. This is wonderful. And so that's how deaf missions, Jesus is the light of the world, so I guess that's fine too, but That's how Deaf Mission started in 1964 or 5. And what he started doing, he started preaching his hearing sermon, right, or to the hearing folks. And even though he probably thought most of the people in the church were deaf, is that kind of what Joel thinks sometimes here? Everybody's deaf when he's preaching. But anyway, and then he would preach the same sermon in sign language in the afternoon to deaf people. So, and there was no church to start, but he just started doing that, and deaf people started coming. And there's a really cool picture of Dad signing his sermon to this deaf congregation that started coming in the early afternoon back in the 60s. And my dad just couldn't stop thinking that, God wanted deaf people to learn about Jesus. So he started Deaf Missions in 1971 in the basement of our home, and I witnessed a ton of cool things, God at work, if you will. And they had a devotional for deaf people that went all around the world, this devotional for years and years. So every day a deaf person could read. Deaf people's language skills, reading skills, are at typically a 5th or 6th grade level. Not because they're not as sharp as we are, it's just their second language, right? And then they started doing the devotional via video because technology allowed you to watch it on your phone. Well, one of the things Dad started in 1984, he started the project of translating the Bible into American Sign Language. Just think about that. Since sign language is a deaf person's first language, and that's the one that they understand things mostly in, he started that project in 1984, and I remember they used to rent the cameras at Channel 3 in Omaha, and they would go in at like midnight and use their high-end cameras to videotape somebody signing the scriptures, and that's how they started what they call the translation project. My dad felt that never would he see the completion of that project, but that project started to accelerate, and they had people like the Green family from Hobby Lobby. I don't know if you know who those people are. They're very, very substantially wealthy. They got behind the translation project and gave a lot of funds to it. Pretty soon there's like 15 translators working on this project all day, every work day for a number of years to finish the Bible in American Sign Language. And in I think it was 22 or 21, they completed the translation project. So a deaf person can go on their phone, it's called the Deaf Bible, and they can type in Matthew 1 through 5, and somebody will sign to them Matthew 1 through 5, right? And how cool is that? I mean, before smartphones, that wasn't obviously possible. And I remember back in the day, it was VHS. If a deaf person wanted the Bible in sign language, they could order Genesis, for example, via VHS. You remember all the way back then. And Deaf Missions would be sending out these videotapes to people and to churches and to Bible studies all across the country of deaf people. And that's how it started, right? And then the internet came around and things like that. But then and I'm kind of excited to share, just this week is a very, very cool week for Deaf Missions, is they produced a movie called The Jesus Movie. Has anybody heard of that here, maybe? Okay, a few of you. And they raised, again, Deaf Missions did, about $4.8 million, it was $4.8 million, I think a little bit over that, to produce a movie for deaf people, all deaf actors. So every actor, there might be a few hearing, but all the main actors are deaf. And it's all in sign language, and it's about Jesus. It's the Jesus Movie. And it is in theaters all across the country. It just finished, and they just completed it. And this week, it's in theaters. In fact, today, they're going to have another showing. So I'm sure thousands of deaf people saw that movie this week. And that all started in that whole effort, if you will. I'm sure God would have found somebody else, right? We're not glorifying my dad here. We're glorifying God using my dad. God would have found somebody else other than Moses, right? Because that work needed to be done. But God used my dad in 1965 to start Deaf Missions. And Deaf Missions now is reaching deaf people all over the world. And that Jesus film will be used all over the world because they're going to try to translate it into other sign languages and things. So that's how I got, so I grew up watching this happen, right? And I was asked often, hey, are you going to do what your dad does when you grow up? Are you going to take over, are you going to lead Deaf Missions? And I was actually asked at one point to consider being the director of Deaf Missions way back in the day, but I just didn't feel called to it. Well, so I did my own thing. I was on a church planting team in Wisconsin. I was a part of a Christian music festival, Life Fest in Wisconsin, if anybody's ever heard of that. I was the director of that for a little while. I moved to Nashville, was in the Christian music industry for a little while. But God pricked my heart with a need. And I won't go into the story of how that happened and when that happened. It was in 2008, for deaf children in poverty. And I started learning. I was actually the marketing director for Deaf Missions for just a couple years, part-time, from a distance. My dad hired me. And I started really owning and learning more about deaf ministry and deaf people around the world. And I was introduced to the number of deaf children in poverty, and I couldn't shake it, okay? And so I had some really good friends that worked at Compassion International. Has anybody heard of Compassion International here? Maybe a few. I won't ask you to raise your hands anymore. I'm wearing you out. But Compassion International serves children in poverty through a sponsorship program. Well, I knew a lot of people in that organization because of my Christian music festival experience that I had in Wisconsin. I met a lot of people. And then I started learning more and more about deaf children in poverty. So this is a little longer, but I thought this is kind of a really powerful week for Deaf Missions, just this last week. And I'm still kind of emotional because, at the end of the film, here I am at a movie theater, Westroads Movie Theater, in Omaha, Nebraska, Thursday, just 3 days ago or whatever, watching a movie produced by Deaf Missions, and the organization my dad started in 1970. At the end, it said, in memory of Dwayne King, and it was kind of emotional. But how cool that deaf people can see the gospel now through that movie. And it all started with somebody taking a step of faith back. I remember Dad leaving. He was the preacher at Griswold, Iowa, just what Joel's doing here, my dad was doing in Central City Christian Church in Griswold, Iowa. And God said, I want you to move to Council Bluffs and start Deaf Missions. And that happened in 1971. Dad took a big step of faith to do that because he had a family to take care of. And God blessed that. But so anyway, we decided that, and Dad was a board member from the get-go with what we're doing, but we decided it needed to be its own nonprofit because of how important this need is. And so this is our logo, and I'm sure all of you know what this means in sign language. It's I-L-Y, and so if you add those together, I love you. And if you add that together, it's a common sign. But we like to say that our logo, if this is God's hand, he's holding the deaf children in the palm of his hand, deaf children in poverty, telling them that he loves them. So we like to say this is a visual representation of, for God so loved the deaf children of the world in poverty that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever, so that's how we like, what we like to say. And we've all seen presentations of poverty situations. I've led trips down to Mexico to build homes when I was a youth minister. Back in the day, I loved being a youth minister, and If anybody's gone maybe on a more mission trip down to Mexico to build homes, I've led 5 or 6 of those. I think I've led 5, building 6 homes in 5 trips. And poverty is tough. Poverty that is desperate. If you have a child who is sick and you don't have enough money to take them to a hospital, maybe it's just strep throat, but you need medication. You're in a desperate situation. If you need food, your family needs food, and you don't have it, that's desperate. And we all know that poverty is desperate. More than 9 million children under the age of 5 die each year, and more than 6 million of these deaths are caused by malnutrition and are preventable. This should break just this screen right here. I'm not saying death necessarily. This is all children. This screen right here should break our hearts as people of God. How can we let children, die of just malnutrition? That's awful. So we know that there's desperation around the world based upon poverty. What does God say about poverty, though? Jeremiah 22:16, He defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well. Is that not what it means to know me? That's an interesting verse, isn't it? So to know God is to defend the cause of the poor and needy. That's pretty powerful. Ezekiel, this one I had never really heard much before until I kind of started putting it into my talk here, but Ezekiel 16. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. Now we know the story about Sodom, but it says she and her daughters were arrogant and overfed. Anybody here overfed? I mean, and then the next word is the one that hits me maybe the strongest. And they were unconcerned. How many Americans are just American Christians, and I'm not trying to dog on the Christians, but just basically unconcerned about poverty? Hey, kiddos, come on in. But they were unconcerned, and they did not help the poor and needy. So obviously, through some of these scriptures, God's saying, I want you to consider and be concerned about the poor and needy. And then we've all seen this scripture. It says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. So I want pure and faultless religion, is to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Those are some pretty strong words from the scriptures that talk about poverty. What we should be concerned about those in poverty. So has anybody heard of Helen Keller here? Do you guys know who Helen Keller is? So we all have learned about Helen Keller. She's really an amazing person. She was both blind and deaf. I can't imagine being either one of those. Do we have anybody here blind or deaf in here? There's one of the things that I learned about her is she learned 5 languages before she passed. I mean, blind and deaf and learned 5 languages. My dad knew 3 languages before he passed. He knew English, sign language, and Pig Latin. I don't know if that's official language or not, but he knew it pretty well. But Helen Keller, knew 5 languages before she passed on. One of the things that she said is, my blindness separates me from material things. So she really didn't care what her couch looked like. It could be paisley, it could be pink, or it could be a nice brown. She just cared what it felt like, probably. But she said, my blindness separates me from things. If she got a new car, we would probably hope she wouldn't drive it, right? But she wouldn't care if it was a Chevy Chevette, you remember those, or maybe a Lexus today. She really wouldn't care a whole lot. But she said, my blindness separates me from material things to enjoying flowers, enjoying material things, but my deafness separates me from people. Relationships happen through communication. And if you're deaf, and you want to communicate with somebody, you need to know a language, right? And a deaf person has to use what language? Sign language, right? They can't listen to what you want to say to them. So communication is a big deal. If you go on vacation, like I don't know how many of you go on vacation each year, but let's say you want to go to Branson, Missouri with your family or your friends, you certainly want to be able to talk with them, tell jokes, make fun of somebody. You shouldn't do that, but you want to have a good time by communicating, laughing, sharing together as a family. Well, if you don't have any way to communicate, you can't enjoy and experience that about life, that communication. And so she said, my deafness separates me from people. And so we're talking about children in poverty, but specifically deaf children in poverty. And this is the group of children that we serve as an organization. And we decided that this is important enough to start a nonprofit. We are 14 years old now, but a deaf child in poverty specifically, often, so over half the time, that would be the majority of the time, right? Anything over half is the majority, have no language at all. And during the worship service, we're going to watch a video called Patrick Speaks. It's a 15-year-old boy who has no language yet, and he's 15. And then in that video, there's an 80-year-old lady who's deaf in Uganda, who has no language. She's lived her entire life with no language. So if you're deaf and you live in a developing country, a poverty area, the chances of you knowing sign language are about half. Half of the deaf children know it, half don't. You might say to yourself, well, Mr. J.D. King, well, why? Why don't deaf children in poverty know sign language? You'd say that's a valid question, right? Well, here's the reason. 9 out of 10, I'm sharing a few numbers here today, but 9 out of 10 deaf children all around the world, doesn't matter what country you live in, are born to hearing parents. It's not just like deaf children are only born to deaf parents, okay? If you're Filipino, your parents are probably Filipino. That's not the case with deafness here. It's just because both parents are deaf doesn't mean they're going to have a deaf child. And just because both parents are hearing doesn't mean they're going to have a hearing child. 9 out of 10 deaf children are born to hearing parents. And then you'd say, well, if you're hearing and a husband and wife have a deaf child, what are the chances that hearing couple already knows sign language to teach their now deaf child sign language? The chances, even here in the United States, how many people know sign language here? I want to ask somebody to raise their hand again. So you know sign language? A little bit? Anybody else? A little bit, The chances are very slim that a hearing couple that have a deaf child would already know sign language to teach their now deaf, the deaf child. And so even in the United States with all sorts of, we got YouTube now, you can go on YouTube and learn sign language. You can take sign language courses. There's a lot of opportunity to learn sign language here in the U.S. But the reality is, even here in the United States where we have a lot of resources, hearing parents struggle to now they have to learn sign language so they can teach their deaf child a language. And it's a difficult situation because you have this couple that's now learning a brand new language trying to teach their child. Take that situation, take it to a poverty country where the parents, and maybe the father's gone, maybe one of them's died of AIDS, they're struggling just to find food, they're struggling just to survive. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, this hearing couple, to find out how to learn sign language and teach their child. Do you understand? That was an eye-opener for me of why this is such a difficult issue in poverty. And it's, again, over half of deaf children in poverty don't even know sign language. So they have no way to communicate, no communication, other than just pointing and maybe what's called home signs. You make up some signs in your home just to make it work. And this is another fact. Every country has their own sign language. I get asked that all the time. Did you know that if you go to Kenya, they have their own sign language? It's not like everybody around the world that's deaf uses the same sign language. You would kind of think that maybe. That makes sense. Well, that's the same reason we don't all use English or Spanish all around the world. Everybody has their own sign language. But so, no way to communicate with your family, with your friends, and so deaf children are isolated because of that. If you have no language, do you think you can get an education? No. So here's a question. It's not meant to be a trick question. But if you're deaf and you want to learn how to read, doesn't matter where you live, but let's say you're deaf and you want to learn how to read, how many languages do you have to learn how to read? Anybody? Any of you kids? Think about that. If you're deaf and you want to learn how to read a book, how many languages do you have to learn to do that? Anybody? It's not a trick question. 2. We got two. Good job. Because you first have to do what? You first have to learn sign language. You don't have any other way. It's just visual. You have to learn sign language. You can't hear. So somebody has to take the time. First, somebody has to know sign language in your community. Somebody has to know sign language enough to care to teach you sign language. And if your parents don't know it, it's going to have to be a teacher, okay? And maybe your parents learn it from somebody. So you have to learn sign language, even here in the United States. And then somebody takes sign language and uses sign language to teach you how to read. And guess what? You have to learn how to read without sounding words out. Can you imagine learning how to read without sounding words out? Well, that's what a deaf person has to do. So I remember when I was a younger version of myself, I had younger children. They are now all driving, let's just say that. But when my kids were like your guys' age and a little bit younger, we would have bedtime reading, right? And at the time we lived in Tennessee, and Dolly Parton would give a new book every month to every kid in Tennessee. It was awesome. So the books would come in the mail, and we would like, oh, we got our new books today. Let's read them tonight. And so we would, at the time when I just had 2 children, each one would lay in the bed next to me, and their faces would be right here. And I'd get the book out, and we would read through it. And that was some of my favorite times as a dad, They don't want to do that anymore for some reason. I don't know why. But I remember we get to the word with, for example. Think about the word with. That's a weird kind of word. It's kind of a weird sounding word, right? But it starts with W, and that sounds like what? What's a W sound like? W. And an I, that's a short A in the word with. And how do you teach a deaf child, long A, short A? You can't. You can't tell them, a long A sounds different than a short A, or a long E sounds different than a short E. And then the T, that's a T. Isn't a T a T? Not if you add a H to it. That's a th. Right? With. Well, that's all sounding things out to make that happen. That's why deaf children, even in educated areas, struggle with the written language. Reading the Bible is tough because they never really fully grab. No, there's some deaf people that read very well, but it's still their second language. It's always going to be their second language, okay? But if you're deaf and you have no language at all, how are you going to get an education? You're not. You can't learn English. You can't learn your language. You can't learn math. You can't learn science. You can't learn. But if you have a language, you can. But if you're deaf and you have no language, the Bible says deaf comes by what? Does anybody remember that verse? Faith comes by hearing. That was kind of a stupid phrase I just said there. Faith comes by hearing. And if you can't hear, how are you going to learn about Jesus? Well, through sign language. But if you don't know sign language, how are you going to learn about Jesus if you have no language at all? And that's at the core of why we exist. We want deaf children around the world to learn about Jesus, the true hope found in Jesus, as well as the hope for an education and a brighter future. But deaf children around the world, especially in poverty, are extremely isolated and taken advantage of because they have no way to communicate with those around them. And what's interesting to me, even in the United States, a deaf child or a deaf person may know a language very well. They may know sign language, they even may know English. But if they come up on somebody on the sidewalk, what are the chances of this culture, knowing sign language to communicate with them? I kind of feel like in the United States, we ought to start teaching sign language, just some signs all the way through our education system, right? Then everybody in the United States eventually would know some signs. But that's just on a side note. So deafness and poverty. Oh, that's the video we're going to watch during the worship service about Patrick, and it's just a great example of 15-year-old boy with no language at all. But our new equation, poverty plus deafness, remember how poverty equals desperation? Poverty plus deafness equals desperation plus isolation. So if you're a deaf child in a poverty area, you're dealing with all of the stuff, all of the difficulty of maybe not having food, maybe not having an education, maybe trying to just make and survive, but you're also in this isolated world that deaf people live in with no language. So according to the World Health Organization, there are approximately 32 million deaf children in the entire world. So, of course, that's going to be an approximate number. And that's all countries combined, okay? But here's 80% of those live in developing countries. And you might ask yourself, well, why such a high percentage in developing countries? Well, first of all, the 1040 window has a lot of people in it, okay? But if you think about it, if you're an expecting mother in, let's just say, Ethiopia, what kind of nutrition do you have on a regular basis? Probably not very good nutrition. What if you get ill and you're an expecting mother in Ethiopia? The chances, you might be able to go see a doctor, but maybe not. The chances of you having some kind of illness or something to cause your baby in the womb to be deaf is much higher. So there's 2 out of 1,000 people are born deaf in the United States each year, approximately. But in developing countries, it's more like 4 out of 1,000 are born deaf. And then, once you're born, the little infant that's born, the chances of you getting malaria, or malaria actually can cause deafness, or some other kind of illness that causes deafness, is much greater in a developing country or a poverty area, okay? So there's more likely going to be 5, 6, or even 7 per 1,000 deaf children in poverty areas. So there is more deaf children per capita in poverty areas. That's why there's around 25 million deaf children that live in poverty. Did anybody know that? I mean, that's a lot of deaf children. And then if we go back to my earlier part of this talk, over half of those kids don't even know sign language. They're isolated. They have no chance for a brighter future. So some of the common challenges facing deaf children in poverty is they're thought of as stupid. So now I've explained, language is difficult for a deaf child. In Uganda, the word kasairu means stupid. So they'll just say, oh, that's a kasairu. They just kind of lump them all, and they just say they're stupid. They just think they're stupid. In Kenya, the word boo-boo means dumb. They'll just say, oh, that's a boo-boo. That's a boo-boo. They just lump deaf people into that category as stupid or dumb. They're thought of as not worth educating. Deaf people in general in a lot of poverty areas are thought of as not worth the time, not worth the effort to educate. Deaf children are sometimes sold like property, and that's true often in Mexico. Deafness is often believed to be a result of evil spirits or a curse from God, sometimes resulting in the deaf child being beaten. And so in poverty countries, South America, other countries, there's a lot of voodoo, a lot of weird belief systems, and they think that the child is deaf because of a curse. It's the curse that caused the deafness. And so sometimes the parents don't want the deaf child around the rest of their children because they don't want the rest of their children to get that same curse. Okay? This is the kind of thinking that happens in. And so sometimes those deaf children are not wanted. Sometimes they're beaten. Deaf children are often cast out of communities and forced to survive alone. So Mother Teresa said this: sometimes we think poverty is only being hungry, naked, and homeless. And I grew up thinking, well, that's what poverty is, not having food, not having clothes. But then she said this, and I read this, and I'm like, oh, wow. But then she said, the poverty of being unwanted. What would you think if you were growing up and your parents didn't want you because they didn't want you? How awful would that be? Unloved or uncared for is the greatest poverty. And that hit me like a brick wall. Having food is one thing. Having somebody to care for you and love you is another. And so that's a really powerful statement. Mother Teresa also said, she was often asked what she believed causes the greatest suffering, and her response was loneliness. See, my mom lost my dad a couple years ago now, and loneliness sets in. And I've learned a lot about loneliness. Loneliness can actually affect your health, I've learned. Loneliness is a tough thing. But if you're in isolation, you have no language, you have no way to communicate even with your family members, that's loneliness. And Mother Teresa, who saw a ton of suffering, said she thought that was the greatest suffering. Wow. So the least of these, I used to lead these trips down to Mexico, and I would require that everybody that went on the trip memorized Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats section there. And at the end of that section it says, they will also answer, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you? And Jesus replied, and I think this is really powerful, one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me. And just think about that phrase, what Jesus said there. But I got to be honest, this verse used to bother me a little bit. And let me explain. I'm like, well, Jesus is calling somebody least. I thought Jesus felt everybody was equal. God loved everybody the same. and that we all have equal access to God and equal value, right? Equal value. And then it hit me, and I'm a little bit slower than the average, so maybe everybody gets this, and I just didn't, right? Okay. But all of the things Jesus mentioned there, hungry, thirsty, stranger, or needing clothes, or sick, or in prison, all those things that he just mentioned, he didn't say lower ACT score, lower IQ, not very athletic. He didn't say that. All these things here are circumstances. I need food. I'm in prison as a circumstance. I need clothes. Those are all just circumstantial things. They're not value. He's not saying, hey, you're less than as far as value. And then it kind of opened up. I'm like, oh, I get it. It's just some people's circumstances are more difficult. And I want to make an argument that deaf children in poverty, when Jesus is talking about the least of these, deaf children in poverty are struggling with the same things that all children in poverty are struggling with, okay? Food, shelter, clothing. But then they're also struggling with this isolation. Nobody cares about me. Nobody thinks I have any value. Nobody wants to educate me. My parents don't love me. What do I exist for? I want to make an argument that I think deaf children in poverty could be classified based upon circumstances, okay? The least of the least. Based upon circumstances. Especially when you're looking at such a large group of people. And I've thought about this now for 14 years, and I'm still struggling to find a group, based upon circumstances, a group of people that large that have it more difficult than deaf children in poverty. Please come up with, your thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts individually. But this is why we exist as an organization, Deaf Child Hope International. We exist to reach out to deaf children in poverty conditions around the world with hope. And that hope is food and water, shelter and safety. And this is a big one, love, care, and acceptance. Hey, deaf child, you have value. We accept you just as you are, and we're going to care for you, and we're going to introduce you to language, to education. So medical attention, the language of sign, educational opportunities, and the gospel message that Jesus loves you and wants you to be in heaven with him. That's pretty powerful that a deaf child would have those things, especially when they think they're not worth anything. And these are some of the deaf children that we serve. They're wearing our Deaf Child Hope t-shirt, and I do have these t-shirts. It's the most stylish t-shirt I've ever seen in my life. Don't you guys all agree? I mean, they go with shirts or jeans. They go with skirts. They go with suit coats or sport coat. They're just very versatile, and you look like cutting-edge fashion. They're only $20, and you can be wearing a cutting-edge fashion t-shirt yourself. But I have all sizes back here if you're interested. But these are deaf children in Ethiopia. My mom actually sponsors the girl on the right. And these are deaf children in Mexico that we serve. These are deaf children in Haiti. Deaf children in Jamaica that we serve. Deaf children in Uganda. And the story here, this little boy in the top right, his name is my name, Jonathan. That's how it's easy for me to remember. And he is getting shoes put on his feet for the very first time ever because he used to be chained to a post. And I'm not making this up. This is real life stuff. It still happens. We don't think this stuff happens. And deaf children are standing around him doing this. This is clapping in sign language, all right? And so deaf children are being rescued for some of the stuff that they're going through. This little girl in the bottom left, her name is Leticia, and the lady, her parents, beautiful little deaf girl in Uganda, her parents simply did not want her. It wasn't that she was orphaned. Her parents did not want her because she was deaf. And the lady in the middle, Chris Detro is her name, the white lady, she adopted Leticia. It took a lot to get her adopted. but Leticia now lives in the United States with her family. Leticia now is, she just won like a beauty contest in the U.S. And how it's a cool story. And she now has a cochlear implant. They did that for her. But again, it's a story of her parents in front of a judge said, we do not want Leticia because she's deaf. And because that judge declared that allowed Chris to adopt her. That's what deaf children are facing, even in this world we're living in. The deaf children in Liberia that we serve, deaf children in Vietnam, the Philippines, Honduras, the U.S., and Kenya. We actually operate an orphanage in Kenya that's called Lance's Deaf Orphans. The tall man in the blue shirt in the bottom there, his name is Lance, and he's deaf, and he started this orphanage in 2008, and he turned it over to us because it was overwhelming him. We've actually been operating Lance's Deaf Orphans for 10, 11 years now. We've done a ton of projects. These are all deaf orphan children right here. Not all deaf children that we serve are orphan, okay? But these are all orphan. And our director is a deaf Kenyan man. His dad is actually a medical doctor in Nairobi, but he's deaf. And he moved to be our director of Lance's Deaf Orphans. So we have all the teachers of Lance's Deaf Orphans are on our payroll. So we keep this orphanage operating. And we have done a lot of projects there. They're awesome kids. I've been able to visit. We actually have a mission trip that's going to be right there in about a week. We've got 3 of our staff that are going to be at this same spot in about a week. There's the staff of Lance's Deaf Orphans, and this is what the campus, there's some more. This is what the campus looked like. I had them do a silly pose. This is what the campus looked like when we took it over. Lance started this from just a grass pasture and raised some money. We've done a lot of different things. We've done a well. We've built another toilet for them. We've got better beds and things. This well was a $45,000 project, and the pump, that's the pump. And then there's solar panels on the top of the tanks that power the pump. So this was a project that now provides water for all of them there. And then if you look on the right, the buildings on the right, we tore those down and built this building instead. And so we were able to put classrooms in the lower level and the girls and boys dorms in the upper level. And they actually have running water now, and they have showers. First time they've ever had showers. First time they've ever had running water when we did the well. So this is one of the locations we serve. All the other locations that we serve, we partner with them to serve the deaf children. How can you help, you might say? Pray for us. I really do believe in the power of prayer. If you could think about us and just say a little prayer for deaf children in poverty, pray for Deaf Child Hope and our effort. We're currently, a sponsorship is $38 a month or $1.25 a day. You could just skip your Starbucks for the week for one day, and that would take care of that probably. We do have children on the back. If you're interested in sponsoring a child, and that sponsorship, and you can write your child, and they will write you, or if they don't know how to write yet, remember the written language is their second language. They may only be able to do a draw and picture or a craft, but we try to do twice a year. Sometimes it's just one time a year that you'll get something from them, but you can write them as well. And you can go visit them. You know, we do have mission trips, and you're welcome to take a trip on your own. We've set that up a number of times. And they will do their best to write to you. And here, the little boy in the top is received his letter from his sponsored family. This is cool stuff when that prayer between the sponsored child and the sponsor is what, just that relationship is pretty powerful. I will say that deaf children in poverty are a little more transient because deaf schools and orphanages draw from a wider area than just hearing children. And so sometimes there's a little more turnover, and so some sponsors get a little frustrated that their child had left, and so we assign a new child, and that's disappointing. But very powerful, the relationship that can be built through sponsorship. And then it provides the food, clothing, shelter. So that revenue stream, it's a consistent revenue stream that we can use to provide all those things for the child. Ways to sponsor a child. You can go online. You can choose girl, boy, what country. We serve children in 11 countries. We're just adding a Congo partner. It's the Republic of Congo. And I'm telling you, they're struggling with food, to have enough money for food there, because there's the war. I don't know if you're familiar, if you follow this, but Congo is really struggling with some civil war and gangs and things like that, violence. And so we're adding they got 60 deaf children there that they're caring for. So we just set up a new partnership with them. And so if you want to choose a Congo child, it would be a blessing to them. And you can do it on your smartphone, your computer, on your tablet. You can fill out a response card today in the back booth. You can call, and our wonderful staff would walk you through it if you're uncomfortable with all the technology stuff, and we can walk you through. You can send a check in each month, or you can do it online. And you can email hello@deafchildhope.org. And then how else can you help? You can sponsor a deaf teacher. And remember how I talked about somebody has to learn sign language and care enough to teach the deaf children sign language. That's a big task, because teachers of the deaf in other countries in poverty areas are thought of as sometimes second-class teachers as well. Why would you spend your time to learn, to be an educator and teach those deaf children that have, that no value, and that's what people think. We know that's not true. But so we believe in deaf child teachers. We currently have 39. By the way, this is our 2023 annual report. We currently have 282 or 3 deaf children sponsored in 11 countries, and the number of partner organizations is now 18. We just added the Congo. And deaf child sponsors, so people that sponsor deaf children through us, live in 40 U.S. states and 4 countries now. And we have 2 Deaf Child Hope mission trips this year. As an organization, we have now sent out around $1.5 million as an organization since we started to care for deaf children in poverty. But our vision is much larger. We would like to see the number of deaf children sponsored be in the thousands, and that's our vision, and we're really shooting for that because of the need is so big. You can financially partner with us. We do need people that say, hey, I believe in what you're doing. Yeah, I like that sponsoring a deaf child thing, but I want to really substantially get behind you. We do need people that say that in churches and individuals, and we do have some, and so it's always wonderful when somebody does that. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and we do weekly posts just to kind of keep you informed. And if you share those, it's cool because that gets the word out. You can buy and wear a stylish Deaf Child Hope t-shirt. You can invite us to present at your event or church, and you can check that one off right now because you've already done that. And you can tell others about Deaf Child Hope, and you can go on a mission trip. You're welcome to take any of these newsletters back on the table. This is a little older, but it has pictures of the well that was built at Lance's Deaf Orphans and some information about that. We also, something kind of cool, does anybody remember the only deaf Miss America? Does anybody remember that in 1995? I know you kids wouldn't remember that. But in 1995, Miss America was deaf. That's the only time that Miss America was deaf, okay? And her name is Heather Whitestone McCallum is her last name now, Heather Whitestone McCallum. And her husband found us online, and they sponsored 2 children through us. And she's done a couple videos for us, and her husband are trying to help us a little bit. So that's been kind of cool to have Miss America on our team. She said she's fine with me saying that she's on our team. So we have Miss America on our team. And you could go on a Deaf Child Hope mission trip. We have a trip going to Jamaica this fall. Really cool trip. It's our least expensive trip because Jamaica's so close. and you can spend time with deaf children there. And it's we do have a trip coming up. They're going to be going to Kenya, Uganda, in about a week here. They're leaving. And there's one of the pictures of the trip. So a real quick story. The gal on the bottom right, she actually lives close to here. She's from Iowa, and she went on our trip to Kenya, and she got into Kenya, and on her way out, she went through customs. They flagged her and took her to the police station. And I'm telling you the reason why. We thought she was going to have to go to jail. Is because her dad is a pheasant hunter, and she took her dad's little suitcase that he used for pheasant hunting, and he accidentally left ammo in the suitcase. And they didn't catch it when she came into Kenya, but they caught it on the way out, and it is extremely against the law in Kenya to have ammo. And we ended up, the American Embassy was going to start, I was going to be calling them, and somebody from there was trying to get a hold of me. Anyway, they let her finally go and fly back home. So the moral of the story is don't take ammo on your mission trips. That's just the story. So that's my presentation. I appreciate you guys listening. I think you've heard how passionate I am about this, because I think there's scriptures in the Bible, and there's even one other scripture recently that God's really put on my heart that I didn't share here, but just that least of the least thing, and some others. It's like God, I think, really wants us to be concerned, not unconcerned, but concerned for the poor. It doesn't have to be all, care for the poor. It doesn't, maybe there's poor in this county, right? I know that. But if you want to help deaf children in poverty, you can do all those, pray for us, sponsor a child, and get involved. And if you want to get involved even more than that, you're welcome to talk with me. So thank you for listening to me. I don't think anybody fell asleep that I saw. So thank you for listening to me. Blessings to you. And I'm going to share just a little bit more during the worship service. So.